Good morning or afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. Today we're going to be looking at automating AP accounts payable invoices using Office 365 and Teams. I have a couple minutes, actually about one more minute till the top of the hour according to my watch, so I'll give everyone another minute here to go ahead and come into the webinar. All right, it looks like according to my watch, we're right at the top of the hour, so we'll go ahead and get started. Again, thank you everyone so much for joining us today. It's going to be a brief meeting, half hour here, just looking at automating AP invoices using Office 365 and Teams. A few housekeeping things. I will do my best to monitor the questions. So if you want to go ahead and put a question in there as we're going through, I will try to keep my eye on that. And then if there's a break, I'll go ahead and pause and address any questions as we're going through this. Again, my name is Mike. I work for DynamicPoint. I'm the Director of Business Development. And today we'll be going over invoice automation using Office 365 and Teams. For sake of full disclosure, we will be showing our product here that is a Office 365 app that you could add to the mix. But even if you don't plan to use our product, hopefully you'll still leave with some tips and tricks and some knowledge of how you could use Office 365 just to support AP processing and invoice automation. So let's go ahead and get it going. Looks like we are set. Everyone's on the call, and I'm gonna go ahead and advance the slide here. So just a quick introduction of who DynamicPoint is. So DynamicPoint, our claim to fame, or what we do here is we create apps on top of Office 365. And for those of you who are not familiar with this concept, the best analogy that I've sort of been able to come up with to explain it is it's very similar to an app that resides on your mobile phone. I'm sure we've all installed apps on our mobile phone, and when we do, it asks us all these questions. Can I use your camera, your location, and all these things that we probably don't read, and we just select yes to. But that is the app leveraging this platform that is provided by either your iPhone or your Android device. And Microsoft provides this whole framework for products and app development companies like us within an Office 365 ecosystem. So that's exactly what we do, is we build apps within this framework that most of our customers already own. So we get to leverage all of this product functionality that I'll talk about in the next slide here in conjunction with our products to make them more flexible. We are created in 2009, which if those of you have followed Office 365, it was not around. It was its predecessor, DPOS, back in the day. And we used to create products on top of SharePoint. And then about 6 years or so ago, with the gain in steam and the adoption of Office 365, began moving all of our products to that new framework. So that's just a little history on us. As far as our product lineup, we have a portal product and we have an expense management. We're gonna skip those today. And the focus today is on this guy right here. And this is our invoice automation product, again, leveraging this Office 365 framework. Today, we're focusing on the Teams integration as well. And really, the process that we are trying to accommodate is everything that happens before this invoice is created in your ERP or your accounting system. So that's like the end game, if you will. But before that invoice gets in there, generally speaking, of course, it has to be received. So it's going to come in from a vendor. We're going to maybe apply some workflow to this and some approval processes. We could use OCR, or optical character recognition, to extrapolate data from this invoice such that we don't have to type it in. There's the whole AP management component of that. And what I mean by that is whether or not I'm doing a PO match or just assigning account elements to this. If it's a non-PO invoice coming in, and then ultimately it is ready for integration. So all of these steps sort of occur before I could put this invoice into my accounting system for payment and posting, obviously. So that is the breadth of what our application is focused on, as well as how we're leveraging Office 365 to manage this process. So the suite of products, right, and all of these apps, if you will, are coming with Office 365 subscription. And I say that a little bit in air quotes because there's many different ways to license Office 365, but most all of them include the whole suite of products, of which I'll cover today. And what we are doing is our app is really being added to this mix and being installed on top of SharePoint. So this ecosystem gives us the ability to add apps to SharePoint, which you could, download from the App Store or just upload directly to your SharePoint tenant. And SharePoint is providing this framework for the product. It's really the user interface. It's where the data is being stored. For today, we're talking about AP invoices. Those are going to be stored in SharePoint in document libraries and things of that nature. So it's really secure in your tenant with Office 365. The data is not being stored anywhere in our cloud or anything of that nature. It is with Office 365 and specifically with your tenant with Microsoft. Workflow is really important to the AP automation process, right? I have an invoice that comes in. I maybe want to automate and apply some RPA to this. Or maybe I want to route it to individuals such that they could review this invoice and approve or reject it. So for that, Microsoft gives us this tool by the name of Power Automate. It is a framework for workflow that is extremely powerful. I could probably spend days just talking about the options on it, but today we are going to focus on how it's being used with the AP automation process to route invoices to the appropriate people for review and approval. So when it comes to gathering the data for invoice submission, probably the more common thing that we see is that the invoices are being submitted via email. Vendors are just emailing them. And by all means, we can most certainly support that. But what I will introduce to you today is the use of some other methods, including Power Apps, including Forms, including Teams. Obviously, Teams is our focus today, which is very integrated with SharePoint as well as the rest of the suite of products. So we'll be looking at that as well on different ways I could submit these invoices. And then when it comes to reporting and analytics, Microsoft provides their go-to reporting tool by the name of Power BI. All of this data is, again, being stored in my tenant, so I could use this tool to begin reporting on this information and looking at outstanding invoices and doing analysis on this process. Okay, so let's talk about the steps, generally speaking, from an AP automation perspective. And generally speaking, there's 3 simple steps, if you will. And this first step is I need to get the invoice, right? It's going to come in from a vendor, of course, because we're talking about AP automation, not AR. So I need to receive this invoice from the vendor. And like I said, probably the one that wins the most amount of votes in my experience is email. It's easy, right? I have a shared inbox, and a vendor could just submit that invoice via a shared inbox, at accounting at dynamicpoint.com or something of that nature, accounts payable. But there's most certainly all kinds of different methods that I could do this. I could use Power Apps. If I have my employees submitting the invoices, maybe I want to do a mobile upload, or if I have contractors in the field that are submitting the invoices, I could do that. I could do a portal entry. I could scan it, and all of these other different methods, which honestly I could take credit for inventing none of them. They all are leveraging out-of-the-box Office 365 functionality in conjunction with a SharePoint library. And this library is serving as our central repository for all these invoices coming in. So they're no longer being buried in email. I can now see them, receive them, and begin taking action on gathering data, routing to the appropriate people, etc. And I'll show, as part of my demo, a lot of these different options of how I could use these Office 365 technologies, again, including Teams here, and we'll go ahead and do an upload from Teams to get those invoices into the system. And really, the method is going to be driven by your business process and your relationship with your vendors, right? If I am working with contractors, getting them to do, a mobile upload or maybe a portal entry could be very applicable because I have that type of influence over those contractors. If my vendor is, I don't know, Home Depot for sake of argument, they're not going to do any of that for me, right? Like I don't have that influence over them. They're going to give me their invoice however they want to, and I really can't influence that submission method. Okay, so after we get the invoice, then we begin step 2 here, which is the processing of this invoice. And this includes using OCR to extrapolate data. It includes the workflow component and includes the use of our app that gives us the integration with the accounting elements, whether this be vendors or POs or accounts, etc., such that we could begin coding this invoice and processing it and putting it to the right GL accounts or doing PO matching to get it ready for the third and final step, which is bringing that into the accounting system. Okay. Enough of my scribbling and talking. Let's go ahead and start looking at this. All right, so here I have a demo site, and this site happens to be integrated with Microsoft Business Central, but we do have, if you look at our integration page on our website, we do have integrations with all kinds of different ERP products. And the layout of this, I guess first of all, to introduce this is just a SharePoint site, right? Which those of you who are familiar with Office 365 are probably recognizing that. The only thing quote unquote special about this is I happen to have our app deployed. So if I were to go to the site contents here, you would see that I've added our app to this site. Otherwise, it's just a normal SharePoint site and I've laid it out basically using those steps that I just introduced. Incoming invoices is that library. It's serving as basically the queue of receiving all these invoices from vendors. I have my processing queue that represents those that are within the workflow. And then I have a link just to my ERP application, in this case, Business Central, to show those that have already integrated. We talk about the Power BI. Power BI is something that I could build all these reports and I could absolutely start using this to share information or provide metrics of where invoices are in this approval process. And I saw a quick question come through. Is this being recorded? The answer is absolutely, and you will all receive a recording of this as well. So don't worry about taking, I guess, too much notes or anything. I'll go ahead and send the recording to everyone after the call. Okay, so we talked about the layout, we talked about the presentation. Let's talk about the users. Who cares about invoices? And again, that's going to vary a little bit about your process. Probably the more common people is accounts payable because they're managing this whole process. But maybe, I want to bring managers into this or other people that I want to invite into this dashboard to have visibility to where these invoices are in the review process. Okay, so let's start with this step 1, incoming invoices. And lo and behold, we were talking about Teams. And I have a Teams site here. And if you guys are familiar with Teams sites, they are highly, highly, highly integrated with SharePoint, right? By creating a Teams site, I basically create a SharePoint site. And let's say I want to submit an invoice that I receive from the vendor, and employees doing this, or if I'm inviting vendors to do this, like I said, is really depending on your business process. Maybe your vendors would never do this and we just want to stick with email, or maybe I have a very distributed buying environment where the invoices are going to employees and I want them to upload them to this library. So I'm going to do that. I'm going to click this simple upload here. And I am going to pick an invoice. Let's go ahead and pick one more too, just to get a couple going. Okay, you can't see it, but it did open up a little pop-up. And what we will see here is, if I refresh my screen, that of course I've just uploaded 2 invoices to this library. And if I were to go over to SharePoint and refresh, you would see those same invoices here too. Again, Teams is highly integrated with SharePoint. So great, right? Like who cares? I've uploaded them, big deal, right? The more interesting thing is what's going on in the background is now we have kicked off a workflow. And what this workflow is doing is saying all of these invoices that come into this library, and I actually have the flow up here if you guys are familiar with Power Automate. So I say when this file is created, we want it to upload it to an OCR process. And I am using a cloud-based OCR tool that extrapolates data from invoices. The one that we're using is by the name of Verify. But what it is doing is getting the data off of those invoices. And if you notice, they're now gone. I'm gonna upload one more just so I can see it really quick and sort of take a pause here to show you. But what it is doing is it's extrapolating data from these invoices that maybe otherwise I would have needed to manually type in. So I now have a new one in the system. And what we will see is this workflow here. Again, if I go look at this, you could see it's running in the background, and you can see here's my runs that are going on. But it is being submitted to this OCR process. And then when it's done, whoa, it's going so fast. I'm sorry, I'm not talking too much. But what you'll see is it writes the data that was captured by this OCR process right back to this library. And then after it captures this data, we bring it into our app. So it's just really here for a brief moment. And what this is serving as is basically a Dropbox for all the invoices coming into the system. So maybe I could catch it this time, but what you'll see is if I sit here and refresh like a madman, that all of the data from this invoice is being captured and written to these columns. And maybe this time it'll take too long since I'm actually waiting on it. It usually happens in a brief minute or two. But if you understand this concept, what I'm going to show you next is all of these different ways that I use to get this. Okay, got it, right? So you see all of the data that OCR was able to recognize and write that immediately back to the library, and boom, it's gone, right? So no one's really hanging out here waiting for this to happen. I'm just showing you how this works. So let's start using our imagination, right? I uploaded that from Teams, but maybe as opposed to using Teams, you know, I have more of a mobile process or the need to submit these from a mobile device. And I happen to have my phone open here. And this is leveraging the OneDrive app. Again, another Microsoft tool here. And sure enough, I have that same invoice library. And let's just go ahead and take a picture. So I happen to have an invoice sitting here on my desk. Lo and behold, and we'll go ahead and take a picture of this using this OneDrive app. As you can see, this OneDrive app is sort of cool. It just doesn't take a picture, it cleans it up. It calls it a scan, right? So I could adjust it and everything, but you can see here that it's actually getting rid of my desk and everything else. And if I go ahead and hit done here, it's gonna give me the ability to enter some metadata. I'm gonna say, forget it, because I'm gonna allow the OCR process to get all that information for me. But if I go ahead and refresh, of course, where do you think that scan went? Went right into this library. Ta-da. So again, we're gonna see OCR kick off on this, and I'm not gonna take you through the pain of me refreshing, but you'll see all of the data be extrapolated from this invoice and written to this library. So everything I've shown you so far, none of it is really involving, you know, DynamicPoint's product. This is just all Office 365 functionality, you know, working with this ecosystem of tools that they provided. So I have uploaded one. I've taken a picture of one from my phone. Let's talk about, you know, Old Faithful, the idea that my vendors are going to email this to me. So I have this AP at dynamicpoint.com. I have an email here. Of course, on my email, I am submitting an invoice because it would sort of not be fun without that. So here's my invoice. And I want to go ahead again and submit or send this. And you've probably figured out that this is going to, again, go into this library, but now it is being received from an external email and being routed to this library. So, not to beat a dead horse, but there's even more options, right? So if I sit here and refresh, or you guys could just trust me that this will briefly take us, oh, there it is. Okay, so that's the one I just submitted via an email. And as you probably figured out, it's going to be going to an OCR process to extrapolate data and into our app. Okay, so let's just talk about a couple others. Again, depending on your process, if I wanted a form, right, generally what we call it is a check request, where internal employees or external users can submit these same invoices. If you're familiar with Microsoft Forms, Forms has the ability to save the content of the form to SharePoint, right? So I didn't mean to do that. So if I fill out this form here and just put in some key data, it's going to ask me for an upload of my invoice, but as opposed to just sending an email, I could require some fields. So maybe you're tracking projects or something like that, and I want to go ahead and require them to submit this as part of the submission process, so I could capture some additional detail here. I'm going to go ahead and upload my invoice, skip the comments, and hit submit. So that was a form. As you probably figured out, it's going to go into that same space, into that library. If I want to do that from a website form, I can most certainly do that from a website form as well. So this is the same idea, just a little bit prettier because it's integrated with our website. Okay, so enough of that. Let's talk, let's move forward. So now that we've submitted this in, a plethora of different options, let's talk about where these invoices are going. And where these invoices are going is into a processing queue. We've received them, we've got all kinds of data, metadata from the invoice, and now they're in this queue, and you can see, I have a ton here that are all auto-created, taking the results of an OCR process and bringing them into our app. And the reason we bring them into our app is now we have this ability to start assigning attributes, whether it be PO matches, right? So this happened to be for a PO invoice, or non-PO, so these are all PO. Let's see if I have non-PO. Oh no, all mine are PO ones, but I could create one really quick. And I'll add an allocation item, which means as opposed to being matched to a PO, we're going to go ahead and assign things like expense types to this, or maybe other things such as like dimensions, and we'll go ahead and save this. So depending on how these invoices are coming here, they're either being matched to POs or I'm putting GL accounts associated to them, and they're all coming into this workbench, if you will, or dashboard that now I have a place to manage them, to perform validation, to match to POs, to also check against ERP data. So you can see here I'm actually getting a warning message saying that this invoice has already been received. And the reason it's already been received is I use that invoice quite often for demos. So I'm just going to go ahead and change the date here and update it. And you'll note that it's going to requery the ERP, in this case Business Central, and say, okay, this is now a valid invoice. It's no longer a duplicate. My error message is gone. All right, so now that I have them all coming into this dashboard, right, this was all automatic. This is where accounts payable is going to live. I could submit it. And what submitting it is going to do is call again this workflow. So again, we're leveraging Power Automate. It's going to kick off an approval process that is going to submit this for review. And as advertised, where does Teams come into play? I submitted it via Teams. I could also review and approve it via Teams. So what we'll see is I'm going to get a notification. In fact, I'll open up my email too, so we could see that aspect as well. But this notification is going to be generated from Power Automate. So you can see here, I just got a notification, and I could click on it here, obviously. But what I should also see coming into my email is a new invoice ready to review and approve. So let's start with the email, and then we'll go look at the other views. Or other ways, I should say, to manage this task, right? So here's the first and foremost one. I got an email and included that invoice. It's included some of the data that I was able to extrapolate. This again is using this Power Automate approval associated to it, and I could approve or reject it, or I could edit it. If my reviewers are part of this review or assignment process, I should say, they could also edit it. But let's go look at this from Teams too. So I'm gonna go ahead and get rid of my email for a sec and open up Teams. Hopefully, there it is, found it. Too much stuff, I apologize. And got it. What you can see here is I also have a feed coming in for my activity feed here saying I have a new invoice ready to review and approve. So if you want to look at it at Teams, it's very similar to the email. I could obviously look at the attachment, I could approve or reject it, or I could edit it. Or there is also an approval app that you could add to Teams too that's part of this Power Automate framework. And it's just a little bit different view. It's obviously it's similar to the activity feed, but as opposed to being jumbled up with the other things that come in the activity feed, I see all of the workflow items separately here in the approval. And last but not least, as you probably figured, Microsoft does have an app for this. So if I were to again bring over my phone here, and sure enough, I have the Power Automate app installed. You can see here's, again, all my invoices that are ready to review and approve. I could click on any of these and approve or reject them, as well as look at the invoice. All right, so let's go ahead and go back to the email and say, hey, this looks good, and carry it forth in the workflow. So the workflow continues to run. You see here, I did get a notification that it has been approved, so that's great, right? And the workflow will continue to run. And as this workflow runs, if I refresh my screen here, we'll see this invoice gets updated in our dashboard, right? So the workflow is being assigned to approvers and different people in the field. You can see it actually dropped out of my view. That's because I have a filter here, but if I clear that filter, what you will see is that the audit log is being populated with each of these steps in the workflow, who to get submitted to, what was their action taken. So it went to my DynamicPoint demo account and they approved it. And then this actually represents the last step in the workflow. So the workflow in this case was only a one-tiered approval. And then after that approval, it integrated directly with my ERP system, of which I could show you here in a second as well. And then all of the notes that were captured as part of the review are also being listed in this notes section. So that was this looks good. And the user who took action on this was the DynamicPoint demo. So if we want to follow this guy all the way through, if I look at my ERP details here, you'll see this is the transaction that just got created. And it gets created in real time. And it leverages what are called web services to call that integration immediately. So if I were to go here and just go to my purchase invoice, oops, sorry, fat fingered that. I don't want purchase orders, I want purchase invoice. And purchase invoices, that looks better. And what we'll see is an invoice that's just been created with all of the details, as well as the invoice attachment has been passed to it as well. So we'll go down to the very bottom here, because that's my latest and greatest. Here's my invoice. The GL account items have been assigned. And if I look here, there's the attachment. So after it was finally approved, it did call those web services and integrate it in real time. So just to recap the steps that we covered, we went through the receipt and the different ways I get to use Office 365. We went through the processing, the different ways I get to use Office 365 from an approval perspective. And last but not least, it brought it into the accounting system ready to be posted and paid. So those are the steps we're taking you through. Again, the hope of all this, right, is that we are leveraging what you own. And it is a framework that is, more flexible and more robust than, anything that we could have developed on our own. Our customers already own it, so we don't have to, of course, charge them for that because they're already using Office 365. And what we are doing is, if you look at the various components that we covered today, the ERP integration, the invoice repository, the workflow, we're really just focused on that one part of the pie. And the rest of it is being provided by Office 365. One more question it looks like just came in. Is the attachment in Business Central a link back? Actually, it is configurable. We could either pass the attachment or provide a drill back. There is a configuration option to either pass that URL as a link, so you could drill back to it, which is stored obviously in SharePoint, or sometimes people want the actual attachment included in the ERP. In my case, it actually passed it as an attachment, but that's not required. We could just pass the URL as well. And it looks like, according to my watch, we're right on time here. So I want to, again, thank you everyone for joining. Here's some more information on DynamicPoint. A lot of information on our website, as well as here's my personal email, mmarson@dynamicpoint.com. I will be following up everyone to include this recording. I can't thank you enough for your time today. Everyone have a great holiday season. And again, I appreciate your focus and dedication you had in giving me a half hour of your time. Take care and thanks again.